For centuries, maps showed an empire larger than Rome, larger than China, yet with no capital, no clear borders, and almost no surviving records. Can you imagine that for a moment? An empire said to stretch across nearly half the known world, moving faster than its rivals, ruling longer than most dynasties, and then fading so completely that even its existence is questioned. This is where things change, because historians don't agree on what this empire really was. Some argue it never existed at all. Others insist it was deliberately erased, redefined, or quietly absorbed into history under different names. So what happened here? Was this a forgotten super empire? Or a misunderstanding on a global scale? And if it vanished, why did it vanish so suddenly? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, we'll uncover an explanation that reframes everything. So grab a coffee or your favorite snack, and welcome to another episode of Deep Records. Let's start with a simple question. What if an empire existed for centuries, and yet almost no one today can clearly explain what it was? According to the maps, Tartary, sometimes written as Tartaria, was not a rumor. It was not a footnote. It appears again and again on European and Asian maps from the 13th century all the way into the 18th. According to the maps, this territory stretches across Eastern Europe through the vast Eurasian steppe into Siberia and deep into Central Asia. Not as scattered regions, not as temporary zones, but as a single, continuous entity. And yet, this is where things start to feel uncomfortable. On these maps, Tartary is not drawn as a collection of small kingdoms. It is labeled clearly, deliberately, Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary. Different names, same idea. If I told you that cartographers across rival nations, people who often disagreed on borders, names, and power, repeatedly acknowledged the same vast entity, you'd expect there to be overwhelming historical clarity, but that clarity never comes. Can you imagine that? Centuries of consistent cartographic agreement, followed by uncertainty. Before you start to question whether these maps were simply decorative or symbolic, it's important to understand something. These were not fantasy drawings. They came from early modern European atlases, state-funded projects, and navigation records. Many of them are preserved today in places like the British Library Archives and the David Rumsey Map Collection. And yet, despite this visual consistency, Tartary remains undefined. No clear borders, no agreed structure, no shared explanation. So the question becomes unavoidable. If this was not a single empire, why was it drawn like one? And if it was something unified, why does it resist every modern definition we try to impose on it? Hold that thought, because once we look beyond the maps, the contradictions only deepen. Let me ask you something. When you imagine an empire, what comes to mind first? A capital city, a throne, walls, archives, palaces. Now imagine removing all of that. This is where things change. Despite centuries of references to Tartary as a vast political power, historians have never agreed on a single capital city. Not one. No Rome, no Constantinople, no Beijing equivalent. Archaeologists have not identified ruins that clearly functioned as a permanent administrative center for this empire. And that absence creates a serious problem, because history, as it is usually written, demands permanence. Tartary refused it. There is also no universally accepted royal lineage, no continuous dynasty recorded across generations. Names appear in fragments, then disappear. Authority seems to shift rather than settle. This isn't how empires are supposed to work. So how did it function? Some historians, including the Eurasian researcher Lev Gumilev, suggested that steppe-based powers operated under a fundamentally different logic. Instead of centralization, they relied on decentralization. Instead of stone capitals, they relied on movement. Leadership was mobile. The administration traveled with the ruling elite. Control flowed along routes, not borders. Can you imagine that? An empire where power is not anchored to a city, but carried across thousands of kilometers. Evidence from nomadic empire studies supports this model. Communication systems depended on speed, relay networks, and personal loyalty rather than buildings or written bureaucracy. Authority was reinforced through presence, not paperwork. When leaders moved, governance moved with them. But here's why that matters. Every traditional comparison fails. Rome collapses without Rome. China fragments when its capital falls. Tartary, if this model is accurate, could lose nothing permanent because nothing was fixed in the first place. Of course, this creates uncertainty. Mobility leaves fewer traces. A moving system is harder to document, harder to categorize, and much easier to misunderstand centuries later. And that misunderstanding may be exactly why Tartary appears so unstable in the historical record. Because once you accept an empire without a center, you're forced to rethink how power itself can exist. Military historians who study steppe warfare agree on one thing. Tartary's strength was not size, it was speed. Can you imagine an army that didn't rely on supply lines, wagons, or fixed routes? Instead, every soldier carried mobility with him. Horses weren't transported, they were infrastructure. Archaeologists and historians have documented nomadic forces capable of changing direction overnight, splitting into multiple units, then reassembling hundreds of kilometers away. This wasn't chaos, it was logistics without weight. And while European powers spent years preparing campaigns, building roads, stockpiling food, arguing over command, Tartarian forces were already moving. While Europe prepared, Tartary had already moved on. Now here's why that matters. Speed isn't just physical, it's psychological. Contemporary accounts describe cities surrendering before battles even began, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because resistance felt pointless. Messengers arrived before armies. Warnings arrived before negotiations. Some researchers believe Tartary operated vast intelligence networks, scouts, envoys, informants, moving faster than official armies ever could. This wasn't brute force, it was anticipation. And when cities were taken, something unusual happened. They weren't always destroyed, many were absorbed. Local administrators remained. Trade continued. Daily life resumed under new authority. Wars were not measured in decades, they were measured in months. Comparative studies between Roman legions and nomadic forces highlight a striking difference. Rome conquered by holding ground. Tartary conquered by flowing through it. But here's the limit of what we know. We understand the mechanics, we can measure the speed, but we still don't fully understand the mindset that allowed an empire to move like this without collapsing under its own momentum. And that leads us to the next mystery. Who were these people when they weren't at war? To understand Tartary, we need to step away from borders, cities, and rulers, and instead look at how people actually lived. Because whatever Tartary was, its strength did not come from stone walls or fixed capitals. It came from a way of thinking. Most researchers agree on one thing. The societies described as Tartarian followed a semi-nomadic rhythm. They moved with the seasons, not randomly, deliberately, following grazing cycles, climate shifts, and long-established routes across the steppe. Can you imagine that kind of life? where stability doesn't mean staying in one place, but knowing when to move, where to move, and who moves with you. Anthropological studies of Central Asian nomadic cultures show something important here. Movement was not chaos, it was structured. Social roles, family units, and responsibilities remained intact even as locations changed. This is where things change. For these societies, identity wasn't tied to land ownership. It was tied to belonging, to kinship, to shared customs, to loyalty within the group. Ethnographic records from early travelers describe communities where rules were rarely written down, yet widely understood. Behavior was guided by tradition, expectation, and reputation, not paperwork, not permanent institutions. If I told you that order can exist without bureaucracy, that authority can be cultural rather than administrative, before you start to question that, consider this. In mobile societies, survival depends on trust, and trust becomes law. Some researchers believe this mindset created a powerful internal coherence, a system flexible enough to adapt, yet strong enough to hold together across vast distances. Of course, much of this remains incomplete. These cultures left fewer written records by design, not by accident. What we know comes from observation, archaeology, and comparison, not direct testimony. But one pattern keeps appearing. For Tartary, identity was stronger than territory. Belief was lived, not enforced, and cohesion came from shared understanding, not centralized control. And that raises a quiet, uncomfortable question. If a society isn't built to stay still, what happens when the world around it begins to demand permanence? That's where the story begins to fracture. Let's slow down here, because this is where the story stops behaving normally. Up to this point, Tartary has been strange, but still abstract. Now it becomes physical. Can you imagine cities, planned, engineered, and functioning, appearing in places where, according to official timelines, they shouldn't exist yet? Architectural historians have identified large urban layouts across Eurasia that show signs of advanced planning. Wide streets laid out in grids, massive stone foundations, drainage systems, earthworks, and transport routes that imply coordination on a scale far beyond temporary settlements. And yet, when researchers try to trace their origins, something curious happens. The buildings are there, the infrastructure is there, but the authorship disappears. Official history provides an answer, but not an explanation. In many cases, these cities are attributed to vague labels: unknown builders, later reconstructions, influences from multiple cultures. If I told you these structures were reassigned after the fact, would that surprise you? Urban archaeology papers show a repeated pattern: cities that seem to predate the administrative systems later credited with building them, infrastructure that appears before the economic or industrial conditions required to support it, roads that connect regions long before those regions were supposedly integrated. This doesn't mean we know who built them, and that's important. Some researchers believe these cities reflect a different model of urbanization, one not centered on permanent capitals, but on networks, nodes rather than centers. Cities designed to be absorbed, reused, and repurposed as control shifted. Others are more cautious. They argue that timelines may be compressed, that records were lost, that reconstruction blurred the original faces, and that's fair. But before you start to question whether this is coincidence, consider this. Many of these cities were later claimed by expanding empires, renamed, rebuilt, and officially redated. Their earlier layers were buried, literally and historically, under new narratives. No dramatic destruction, no erased ruins, just quiet attribution changes. And once a city is renamed, its past becomes negotiable. This leads us to an uncomfortable question, not about who built these cities, but about who decides when history begins. Now, this is where things become uncomfortable. Because the deeper historians look into Tartary, the less certain they become about what it actually was. If I told you that some scholars don't believe Tartary was an empire at all, would that surprise you? In modern historical research, Tartary is often described as a catch-all term, a label used by European mapmakers to describe vast, unfamiliar lands east of their known world, not a unified state, not a single political system, but a convenient name for regions they didn't fully understand. From this perspective, Tartary wasn't an empire, it was a cartographic shortcut. Several historians argue exactly that. They point out that European maps frequently grouped unrelated peoples under broad labels. Tartary, in this view, was cultural rather than political, a loose description of nomadic societies, languages, and customs, not a centralized power. But here's where the disagreement deepens. Other researchers push back. They ask a simple question. If Tartary was only a vague label, why did maps distinguish between different Tartaries? Why did some regions appear as independent, others as controlled, others as contested? This is where historians like Francis Wood enter the conversation. Wood has argued that much of what we think we know about Central and Inner Asia is shaped by later interpretations, not contemporary understanding. That early sources were inconsistent and later historians tried to force clarity where none existed. And then there's the third position, the most controversial one. Some scholars believe Tartary did represent real systems of power, but those systems didn't survive the transition into modern nation-states. As borders hardened and empires standardized their records, anything that didn't fit the new administrative model was fragmented, renamed, or absorbed into other histories. Archaeologists can confirm cultures, anthropologists can trace lifeways, but political identity? That's harder to pin down. And so Tartary remains suspended between explanations, a misunderstanding, a lost framework, or something deliberately simplified over time. Before you start to question which version is correct, remember this: history doesn't erase things loudly. Sometimes it just disagrees until memory fades. And that leads us to the final mystery. Can you imagine an empire ending without a final battle? No decisive defeat, no single collapse, no moment you can point to and say, this is where it ended, this is where things change. Because Tartary did not fall the way empires usually do. It didn't shatter under invasion, it didn't disappear overnight. Instead, it faded, slowly, quietly, almost politely. Historical records show no final war that erased Tartary from the map. What we see instead is something far less dramatic and far more effective: absorption. Territories once labeled as Tartarian were gradually folded into expanding states, administered by new governments, ruled under new names, counted, taxed, catalogued differently. Renaming followed. The word Tartary began to vanish from official documents, not replaced by a single successor, but by many smaller labels, regions, provinces, borders. And this is important, because borders don't just organize land, they organize memories. If I told you that maps changed before history did, would that surprise you? Cartographic studies show that across the 18th and 19th centuries, Tartary slowly disappears from maps, not crossed out, not marked as defeated, just reclassified. Political geography researchers point out that once a name vanishes from maps, it rarely survives in public memory, and when memory fades, identity follows. Here's why that matters. Tartary wasn't structured like the empires that replaced it. It didn't rely on fixed capitals. It didn't define itself by rigid borders. And as the modern world began to favor centralized administration and static governance, that way of existing became unintelligible. Some historians argue this wasn't destruction, it was incompatible. A system built on movement, flexibility, and fluid identity entered a world obsessed with permanence and control, and it couldn't be translated.
So Tartary didn't disappear because it lost power. It disappeared because the world stopped recognizing power that didn't stand still. Absorbed, renamed, redefined. And once that process was complete, the maps no longer needed the word. What remains now isn't an empire, it's a gap. A silence in the historical record where something vast once existed. And the most unsettling question isn't whether Tartary was real, it's how many other histories vanished the same way, not through defeat, but through forgetting.
History teaches us to look for ruins, burned capitals, collapsed walls, clear endings. But Tartary leaves us with something far more disturbing. No final battle, no single moment of collapse, just names changing, borders redrawn, and memory slowly adjusted. If an empire can disappear without being defeated, if it can vanish simply because it no longer fits the way we describe the world, then ask yourself this, quietly, before the screen fades to black. How many other empires vanished, not by defeat, but by definition?